What's good, big dogs? Welcome back into the BDGE Dynasty channel. My name's Adam. If you're new to the channel, go down and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content that we're bringing to you here on the game of Dynasty. Earlier this week on Tuesday, I ran a live stream essentially doing a Q&A, a Q and assault for you, kind of talking with you through some Dynasty things, some questions you may have. If you have any directions or thought processes that you want to go over in the game of Dynasty, make sure you're tapping into those. I'm going to be running them a little more regularly here, at least on an every other week basis, if not weekly. So make sure you're tapping into those and let me know down in the comments what you want to yap about in future Q and assaults. Now, with that being said, what I want to do today is go back and talk about Dynasty rookie picks, essentially looking at what we can take actionably from picks, let's say in the first and the second round. So what I'm going to do is actually use the ADP data from Sleeper that Andrew actually did a video on and talking about the production hit rates from 2019 to 2023. At the end of the day, one of the hardest things for people to wrap their head around is the combination of age plus production and really figuring out how to assess and value Dynasty players, picks, and assets accordingly. So with that ADP and production hit rates that Andrew used, we're going to be using that, but then adding in the Dynasty value. We're going to be using Keep Trade Cut and then also baking in not just the Dynasty value that Keep Trade Cut says. While that's nice, we got to have real actionable trades that went down in real leagues over that time. So we're going to have to get nostalgic on it. We're going to take a trip down memory lane. I got the old Browns jersey on, Joe Hayden, back when they still sucked and they still haven't won because they haven't won the division since 1989. But before we do that, you already know what we got to do. Shouldn't even have to tell you. I came pre-tucked. Hi. All right, so let's get straight into this here. And what I'm going to be doing is taking a look at the second round ADP today. Next week, I'm going to get into the first round. And the reason I want to start with the second round is right now, at least anyway, in most leagues, the second round picks feel so devalued to first rounds. And when you start to take a look at what the production has been from these second round picks, you start to see how many have been top 12 finishers at the position. You see how low that number is, as well as how many have been top 24 finishers at the position even, let's say. And you see the production hit rates and how infrequently these players, whether it's been 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, etc., that they've been in the NFL and on our fantasy and dynasty teams. I think it's really easy to kind of look at that and then start dismissing second round picks even more, or also basically just underappreciating and undervaluing second round picks. And I think it's really important to talk about this, at least for me, the way I've started to view and think about second round picks. And ultimately what I want to do is circle back to one of the big heartache trades that I did not make, I should have made. And it goes back to the 2021 rookie class. Another player with a lot of buzz around him was Rondale Moore coming out of Purdue. He was typically available in the early part of second rounds at least. Sometimes would go late first if someone was bullish on him, but because the class was so talented, he would fall into the second rounds. And this is a guy coming out of Purdue that had a ridiculously early breakout age at true freshman, 18 years old, had basically 1,500 yards receiving and 12 touchdowns, and had a massive college target share, 32% I believe it was. He was a prospect that had a lot of buzz around him in his freshman season. He was highly touted, but then oddly the next 2 seasons dealt with some injuries, and ultimately we didn't have enough on paper with him as far as what he did in his sophomore and junior season. So we're going to let the NFL kind of decide what to do with Rondale Moore. The NFL spoke, and at the time we had Kyler Murray needing some weapons in Arizona. They took Rondale Moore, the Arizona Cardinals did, in the early part of the second round, very early. I think it was the 34th overall pick. So with all that buzz and hype, Rondale Moore was a person I had on a fair amount of my teams. I was kind of targeting him in the early part of the second round, and if he fell at all, someone that I was trying to trade actively and go get. So now with all this buzz and hype, in week 1 of his rookie season, he ends up checking enough of the boxes. I think he had like 68 yards, 5 catches, did enough for people to think that Rondale Moore is going to become the featured weapon. Then right away in week 2, Rondale Moore kind of explodes. He has 7 catches on 8 targets, 114 yards, and has a touchdown, had a really long play that game. And at that point, kind of his dynasty value and the euphoria around him really exploded. Rondale Moore, through 2 weeks now, was going to become the franchise receiver for the Cardinals, and in dynasty circles was somebody that you had to have. Someone that not only is doing well in week 2, but this is a guy that you can start to project for the production, for the long haul. This talent going with Kyler Murray, these 2 short players that are so dynamic, everyone was really high on Rondale Moore and bought into this. So I start getting a ton of interest and people sending me offers left and right for Rondale Moore. Basically, I just got Rondale Moore. I just drafted him. He's starting to do well and everybody's hitting me up. No, leave me alone. I want to see Rondale Moore start to play well, and I want to reap the rewards of this draft pick that I had, right? Because all this hype is there, it just makes sense. And I'm basically telling people kind of to piss off. There was some offers coming in. A lot of times you get offers for a player like that has a lot of hype around him. And while they do want to acquire him, they're not willing to send you anywhere near what it takes, because everybody still kind of has this sunk cost fallacy. Oh, well, he was an early second round pick. So here's a second round pick or a second and a third round pick in the 22 class or the 23 class. And you're like, no, that's not what it's going to cost. It's going to cost at least a first. So I did have someone, T-Rock, in the Fade the Fetal League actually hitting me up about Rondale Moore. And I could tell he really wanted him, and he was buying into the hype around Rondale. But for me, he was someone that I was viewing more so as a staple of my team in the future. I was in a productive struggle. Essentially, the idea there is you're starting to draft some really young players that are going to grow and blossom into producers in the next 2-3 years, and eventually you're going to have this juggernaut of players that are starting to hit their prime, and ultimately you're not really old at any position. So this productive struggle, I was kind of viewing Rondale Moore as a staple of my team. So T-Rock sends me a DM in Sleeper. All right, so what would it take to acquire Rondale Moore? Essentially acknowledging he knows that I know Rondale's price has gone up significantly, and he initially sends an offer straight out of a 22 first. Now, keep in mind, it was a 21 second and early second. So he sends me a 22 first and Jamal Williams. Now, at the time, Jamal Williams was in the backfield with DeAndre Swift. I was a DeAndre Swift truther at the time, another RIP take. But point was, he was not someone that I was viewing as a player that I wanted to really pick up on this team that I'm trying to really rebuild and retool for the next year or two. I felt like he was an older asset that didn't necessarily carry a lot of weight in Dynasty that I'd have to try to flip later. So I didn't want to really have to do that when I already had Rondale. So then he kind of countered back with Quez Watkins. I said I'm not interested in him. Then he ups the offer to a 22 first and a third. And at this point, he's definitely willing to try to play ball and overpay for Rondale or do what it would take to get the deal done. And because I'm sensing that, I'm like, all right, I need to get at least enough of a profit here to make it worth my while. So even if Rondale Moore does end up having a great career, that I'm not going to look back and think, oh man, how am I going to replace number 4 for the Cardinals, this guy that's going to be so dynamic? So at this point, I basically tell him I need to get a 22 first and a 23 second from your team. Otherwise, I'm probably going to walk. I sent the offer out. He basically sent me a DM saying that he was going to try to make a couple more trades to essentially recoup some draft capital from other managers so they didn't feel as bad about sending away draft picks like this for Rondale and what was probably viewed by market as an overpay, but a player that's ascending in value. At that point, I'm like, listen, T-Rock, I'm not really anxious to move off of Rondale. I took the trade offer off the table and I said, if you're willing to and you want to, this is the price. Let me know later. Well, unfortunately, while that sounds good in theory, that week 2 was essentially the only time Rondale Moore was as desirable as he was then. And essentially his career turned out to be a massive bust. The production he had for the rest of the season in his rookie year, nowhere near as electric in that week 2 game. And then every single year after that, there was kind of some hopium around the name cachet of Rondale Moore. He's going to figure it out this year. Now we've had 3 years of Rondale Moore, and he hasn't done anywhere near enough for teams. He's moved on from the Cardinals, and his dynasty value is in the sewer. And now every time I look at my Fade the Fetal roster, I see Rondale Moore, who right now I personally view as a roster clogger on that team. I could have re-rolled Rondale Moore from that second round pick that I drafted him at and turned it into a first and a third. But when I look back, that's really been something and a part of a lesson for me and an overall process that I really want to get into you here with. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this second round data. So I want to start back at the 2019 class. Now, one part of this column for me is incomplete just because of Keep Trade Cut and the way that their data works. Keep Trade Cut didn't start having data tracking and any data on their website until the 2020 season. So the early part, basically when these guys came in their 2019 season, what their dynasty value was on Keep Trade Cut is not available. That type of information didn't exist. Keep Trade Cut wasn't around. So when we look though, what I'm basically doing and kind of categorizing for the dynasty value from Keep Trade Cut for all these players, the first thing I'm doing is taking a look at their dynasty value when they were drafted, or essentially right after the NFL draft. So the early part of May, going ahead and taking a look at what their dynasty value was on Keep Trade Cut. And then throughout their entire career, obviously we get to the point where now they are currently, as far as their dynasty value goes. Now for the 2019 class, we have a lot longer to take a look at these guys. So Hollywood Brown currently still is the 119th overall player, wide receiver 47, but his dynasty value is really starting to kind of hang on by a thread. If he has a good season this year in Kansas City, let's say Rashee Rice misses some time with the suspension and he has a good year, maybe he can get a little boost in dynasty value. But at this point, Hollywood Brown realistically is only as good as his production is for dynasty teams because this is a 2019 rookie. People really can't say that it's going to happen in the future for Hollywood Brown. He needs to do it now. So his dynasty value is really tied hand in hand to his production. You take a look at everybody else on this list. Daniel Jones, actually an interesting case because it was just last year that he had his best season. Before he ended up tearing his ACL this year and had a regression as far as his fantasy output, he was overall player 40, the highest of everybody last season. He was quarterback 11. 5980 was his keep trade cut value. That was in March of 2023 when he hit his peak. And then don't sleep on the 211 at this pick. Diontae Johnson, wide receiver 11 was his peak in the 2021 season with Big Ben at the helm at the end of that year. He was playing really great. I think he was wide receiver 8 overall on the season. He had a lot of touchdowns relative to what he's used to seeing, and Big Ben was peppering him with targets. We'll see what Diontae can do in Carolina, but right now, Diontae overall wide receiver 45, and overall for all the players in general, number 111 as far as dynasty value on keep trade cut. So right now in this class, as far as what it currently stands, if you were to hold these players throughout the entirety of their career, 119 Hollywood Brown, 138 Daniel Jones, and 111 Diontae Johnson. Now, what they are in dynasty value, what they've done in production versus what they were at their peak or any point really where they had a lot of dynasty value as far as tradability goes, those are completely different conversation. But when you take a look overall at what 2020 gave us, Keyshawn Vaughn, running back 30, 37-14 in early May when he was drafted. He was a top 100 player, actually, relative to the field, all positions, including Superflex. He was the 92nd overall player in Keep Trade Cut rankings. He peaked not very long after the draft, basically just a month later, June 12th, he hit his dynasty peak. It was overall player 89 and 41.98, running back 28. So basically, just off of some buzz and some hype, he got a little bit of a bump. But overall, he didn't do really shit for us on the field. And if you didn't sell in that 1 month window, his dynasty value kind of treaded down. But overall, take a look at this 2020 class, right? So you got Michael Pittman at the 202. Right now, currently, he is a top 50 player, the 50th player currently today on Keep Trade Cut. Wide receiver 18, 51.98 overall dynasty value. And then Michael Pittman at his peak in the 2022 season, so September of 22, he was wide receiver 6, 58.08, and overall in Superflex was a top 15 option. The hype and buzz around Michael Pittman was at a peak, and he played really well early on in the year, but he never got close to that top 15 again. I think he's currently still in the range of being a top 15 receiver, but top 15 overall, that was when absolutely Michael Pittman's peak hit. Then you have T. Higgins, very similarly. Wide receiver 5 was his peak, 67.71. Overall, all positions, 14th in Keep Trade Cut. That was in April of 2021. So you're talking about a whole year removed from his rookie season. T. Higgins was a top 14. So you got Antonio Gibson, the running back 63, only 793 overall, the 204 as far as Keep Trade Cut value goes at the time of pulling this in May. So you take a look at what he became in that offense. Antonio Gibson had 2 top 12 finishes at the running back position. He was 7,116, 7,116 as far as his dynasty value goes on Keep Trade Cut. Overall, across all positions, the running back was still, people were chasing that bell cow usage that he was getting and all the upside that he had with that home run speed. On April 5th of 2021, he was a top 10 overall player on Keep Trade Cut. You see what he is now. Now he's going to be the backup to Ramondre Stevenson, just got paid. This is a guy that's outside the top 200. But just think about that for a second. This was a guy that at the 207 pick, he had a long window where he gave you 2 top 12 seasons at the running back position. It may not have been that in points per game, but that type of buzz, you had so long as far as dynasty value goes for him to really trade out of him at multiple points to get either a profit, or even when he was trailing down, you still could have cut your losses and got ahead of more than what you paid for him at the 207 while still getting some production out of him for 2 years. So when you take a look, obviously there's Denzel Mims became a bust, but Zach Moss actually quietly ended up having a decent little year last year in Indianapolis. Now he's going to be poised to potentially have a really big role in Cincinnati. Jordan Love, another enigma in this class, right? His dynasty value was trending the wrong way. When Green Bay gave Aaron Rodgers a contract after drafting Jordan Love, at that point people were writing him off. He went from, in his low, being overall 238, basically what Noah Fant was currently right now, to now being a top 15 overall player, quarterback 9. So there's a lot of value when you think about what this 2020 class is. Now, we're going to get into that in round 1. part of it probably is because there were so many running backs being drafted in the first round of this draft. But basically, when you look back at the 2019 and 2020 seasons, the second round picks based on ADP, while certainly there's some busts in here, there was a lot of players that overall ascended in value. And if you would have tried to trade away, not necessarily at the peak, it's hard to necessarily know what the peak is for every player, but when their value accrual is happening. One of the hardest things to do, though, is during that value accrual, essentially seeing the players start to do well in the field and the dynasty price rise, have the discipline to realize, where are they right now currently as far as dynasty value goes, and relative to what they're being valued around them, players being adjacent in the rankings, is this somebody that I should be trading away? How bullish am I on this player? And kind of thinking about this, I think, is a big thing. So I'm going to get into the 2021 class and kind of what the second round ADP has been and what their values are. But I want to give you some context, some parallels to think about currently in market value to help you really think about what these players were worth. Like for Gibson, when I say a top 10 overall player on Keep Trade Cut, kind of some players currently in market to give you an idea of what that really looks like. So 9 right now is Amon-Ra St. Brown, 10 is Bijan, 11 is Marv, 12 is Burrow, 13 is A-Rich. Those are the top 10 neighborhood players on Keep Trade Cut overall. That's where Antonio Gibson was. You have 24th, A.J. Brown. 25 right now is an early 24 first, which is kind of insane. But 25th overall player, early first. 26, Malik Neighbors. 27, Jaden Daniels. 28, Trevor Lawrence. So those are the neighborhood of being a top 25 player overall, all positions on Keep Trade Cut. So then you have the top 50 range. A mid first is 49th overall. 50th, Michael Pittman Jr., 51st, Jared Goff after just getting the bag from Detroit. 52, DK Metcalf. And then currently what the top 100 looks like on Keep Trade Cut here. Deshaun Watson, 99th. Cooper Kupp is 98th. Baker Mayfield is 97th. And then just to give you some names that are just outside of the top 100, you have Amari Cooper at 103. Derrick Henry at 105 and Chris Godwin at 107. So when I talk about being inside the top 100, just to give you an idea of some players currently at market to kind of compare to. So let's take a look at 21 here. We're going to keep going through this. Rashad Bateman, Shotty B, when they moved on from Hollywood in Baltimore, his dynasty value went bananas. So this is a guy coming out, was wide receiver 32, 48-32, inside the top 100, right out of the gates, basically being drafted in the first round. He was overall 89, but he peaked at wide receiver 17, 52-59 overall as far as dynasty value goes on Keep Trade Cut. Overall position, 43rd. And that was in September of 2022. So that was actually going into his sophomore year. They were expecting huge things, and I was a part of that crowd for Rashad Bateman. You take a look here, you got Trey Sermon, Michael Carter, Rondale Moore, Elijah Moore, Terrace Marshall. Amon-Ra St. Brown obviously sticks out here, a guy that's inside the top 10 currently, and one of the 2 players on the list that we have of all the sample size for the ADP in the second round that got into the top 10 overall for all positions. Then you have Kadarius Toney, Kenneth Gainwell, Amari Rodgers, Chuba Hubbard. Like, you can kind of see at the end of this list, right? When you look at the chart, there's a ton of players that busted here. You have one player right now, Pat Freiermuth, who there's a little hope now with Russ in town and not such dog shit quarterback play of Kenny Pickett that he might return value a little bit to what he was when he was closer to that top 100 range at his peak. But he's the only other player that's not named Amon-Ra St. Brown in this 2021 class, which had a lot of talent and hype around it, that's basically worth anything. So Pat Freiermuth is overall 145, which is tight end 13. Pretty high for Pat Freiermuth currently when you think about all the tight ends in the landscape at the moment. Amon-Ra St. Brown obviously is him. Overall player 9, 84-20 on Keep Trade Cut, wide receiver 4. But you look at the rest of this list. I mean, you're looking at players well outside the top 200, top 300, top 400, and these players are corpses. But if you look, what's really interesting, while that's the case, look at this class. So from what we know currently in their trade market right now, what Keep Trade Cut has them, like you're looking at guys that just completely screwed you. If you had this whole second round, Amon-Ra probably makes up for it because he's that good. But everybody else really super disappointed for you. But take a look at when their peaks were, right? So you got Rashad Bateman ended up being inside the top 50. You have Trey Sermon just had a projection for the San Francisco offense, being, in that Shanahan offense, top 70. He was 67th overall at his peak. Michael Carter was running back 18, also inside the top 75. Overall, all players in Superflex leagues. So you had Rondale Moore, I talked about. I wish I would have traded him. He got to damn near inside the top 50, 57th overall. Then you got Elijah Moore. He was wide receiver 15 at his peak, inside the top 40, all positions. You're looking at basically, the point I'm trying to make here is that all these players, yeah, maybe you didn't necessarily see the peak coming and you knew exactly when to sell them at their peak window. But realistically, when you have the whole picture of this, relying on too many second round picks to really get to high end production. Not saying that some of these guys won't do that for you, but they're going to be kind of more the exception to the rule. But when you think about how their trade value was, even if you didn't trade Elijah Moore at wide receiver 15, let's say you traded him at wide receiver 20 or 25, you may not have loved that at the time because you're really into Elijah Moore. You think coming out of Ole Miss and what he did early on in the Jets, that he's going to end up turning into the next big thing. But realistically, where he got to in price, top 40? I mean, he was being valued with guys that currently are the real thing. So what I'm going to do is actually go through and give you some trades to really kind of hammer this point home. But just think about that with where their value is currently. Outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, the whole second round really flamed out as far as value goes, but they all had massive peaks as far as dynasty value. So then when you look at this 24 class, right? So you got Bo Nix, rare scenario of a first round quarterback actually being the 201 in the class. A lot of things are changing kind of in the market, so that's part of it, but he's currently overall player 96, quarterback 23. Keon Coleman, second round to the Buffalo Bills, 84th overall, all players in Superflex leagues, wide receiver 33. Running back 15, Trey Benson, already 83rd overall. Michael Penix, I think, is probably one of the most unique situations we've ever seen. He's someone I'm really bullish on. You can go back and check that video out if you'd like to. Quarterback 22, overall player 90. But then you start getting to Ricky Pearsall, who knows what that situation is going to be. Currently overall 105th as far as player values go. Wide receiver 40. You got wide receiver 47, Xavier Legette. He's overall 120. You keep going down this board, right? All these guys are inside the top 150. And you start thinking about what is their role going to be this year. They don't necessarily have to do all that much. When you start to think about all of these players and when they hit their peak, a lot of them hit their peak in their first or second season, right? And when you think about, they don't necessarily have to be a elite producer. That's kind of the point of this video. But when you get to the point of seeing their value really increase, I think it's really important to gauge like how high it's going up. And then ultimately, what is the profile I'm looking at? What is this player? How bullish am I on this player? And even if you're bullish and you're really excited because they've had 2-3 good weeks in a row, or they're starting to get a lot of hype around them, right? That's one of the euphorias, one of the great feelings in Dynasty, to have drafted a player, been right on him in the second round, third round later, and you're starting to see them really do well on the field. I think it's really important to think about like what stratosphere are they getting to, right? So I kind of have this tiered out with the way that the players are being valued overall on Keep Trade Cut or just in Dynasty. So I have a top 150 player. I think realistically a top 150 player in Dynasty, the range of outcomes for these young rookies or sophomore type players, they can probably, based on not a whole lot of production, really get a bump in value. And based on being just a top 150 player, you may not be able to sell for a whole lot. So right now, when you're still having some hope and you want to see that through, I kind of get it. Once you start getting inside of the top 100 though, I think that's when you kind of have to start having the conversation. Okay, what is this player? Like realistically, look at the profile, look at what they're getting right now as far as workload, what kind of production they're getting, and then ultimately, like based on the players being valued around them, if I was to trade one for one, you can probably say right now, yeah, like Jaden Reed, I can see him going to the moon. I can see him being a top 12 or 15 wide receiver in Dynasty. He's already almost been that. So you're not wrong, but from a production standpoint, is he going to get there? Talented as he may be, is he realistically someone that you'd rather have than a DK Metcalf, who at this point Dynasty gamers are kind of getting a little bit tired of? I don't know why. He's not the old wide receiver one overall in Dynasty that he once was in the past, but this is a guy that still produces inside the top 24 and has done that for quite some time. And now with an offensive change of philosophy, there's probably more upside there, similar to when he was playing with Russ. Maybe not quite that much, but the point is, that's a guy that has stable Dynasty value and also production. In Dynasty, with Jaden Reed or any of these type of players, when they start getting inside the top 100 and then they start getting inside the top 75, inside the top 50, the closer they're getting players like Michael Pittman, closer to players like DK Metcalf, a mid-first round pick, there's a couple things to think about. One, trading out for a player that is going to just give you more stable production. And while they may not be quite as appealing and not quite have as much buzz around them, that's probably a really significant trade that you can make for your team to help you get more production and also lock in more stable Dynasty value for your team. Or I think one of the biggest things, especially with second round picks, because of the hit rate in Dynasty value and in production, I think re-rolling is really important. So there's a couple different ways to look at it. If you have a player that's ascending in value and really desirable, it's right to ask for a lot of profit than what you drafted that person at. The sunk cost fallacy, like what he costs in a rookie draft or what he costs in a startup, that goes out the window if it's an ascending player. But also bring back that Rondale Moore conversation. Rondale Moore I drafted in the early part of the second round. Right now, I would love to have that 23 first or a 22 first and a third on my team relative to having Rondale Moore, because the longer these players that you draft in the second round start to play, good or bad, they're going to start cementing themselves as that. And if the upside doesn't start to hit production at a certain point, now you're getting left with the bag. And overall, that's where I think, let's talk about some of these trades that have gone down. During the peaks, I think there's a point of selling for a profit, whether that's re-rolling into more future liquidity or getting into a safer player, or tearing up from that player that's viewed in a much better light than they've ever been in Dynasty, and tearing up into a player that you probably had no business getting to in the first place. So I'll go ahead, I'll start with myself. So here's a trade where realistically it's not like egregiously bad looking back on it, but definitely I was buying into the Rashad Bateman hype. Not a good trade. And I was buying Rashad Bateman close to his peak here. This trade was made June 27th in 2022. So I get Dallas Goedert, David Montgomery, and Rashad Bateman. I send away Gerald Everett, Travis Etienne, probably right now the most valuable piece in the deal, Tyler Algier, who was having his own little hype at that point, and then a 23 first. So this was paying for Rashad Bateman in the hype, right? This is one of the things I've learned is, okay, he's wide receiver 17, and I'm excited for him. I think he can take over the workload that, like, all those vacated targets that Hollywood Brown left and gave Rashad Bateman the opportunity to take over. But at this point, I would have been so much better off investing a 23 first and Travis Etienne even, who in his own right was a producer. I shouldn't have been making this trade at all, but can I pivot Travis Etienne and a 23 first into a player that's similarly ranged as, you know, Rashad Bateman inside the top 15 without anywhere near that type of risk, because we haven't seen the production from him at all. This is kind of where, when you get into that top 50 overall price point, the hype sometimes can make you make trades that are really dumb as far as looking at production. So I pulled multiple trades here, somewhat in the range of the peak. It wasn't obviously the exact peak. It's not going to be able to be the same day that his peak value hit, but around the time when the hype was at its peak, and at its highest, the buzz for Rashad Bateman. I think these are still type of trades you can get done when either their, you know, hype is at its peak, or they're coming off of 1, 2, 3 really good weeks in a row where people are starting to think the world of this type of a player because they're young and ascending. So right here, Rashad Bateman, you could have pivoted Rashad Bateman and a 23 second to Deebo Samuel. At that point, Deebo Samuel was really highly valued in Dynasty. The reality is you're getting off of the risk, the downside risk, to get into a more secure asset in Deebo Samuel. And while he has his injury concerns, this is a guy that, when healthy, has been inside the top 50, 60 players overall in Dynasty. So, like, that's a very good way to mitigate some of the risk of Rashad Bateman and actually, like, capitalize and actualize some of the profit that you've had by drafting Rashad Bateman in the second round. Mark Andrews here. Like, this is a perfect way to do it too, especially if you can get multiple players that are second round picks, like Michael Carter, another second round pick, pairing Logan Thomas. You're getting into Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews had been a steady producer and a very, very good tight end, elite tight end in certain. You trade Jahan Dotson and Rashad Bateman, two young ascending second round players that certainly had some hype around them, but the odds are not in their favor. And Cooper Kupp has already shown you elite seasons in fantasy football and a great rapport with Matthew Stafford. Rashad Bateman in a second for DK, very similar to the Deebo Samuel trade, and then Rashad Bateman in a fourth for DJ Moore. Okay, and here's Trey Sermon. So Trey Sermon is one of the rare scenarios where I think the hype right out of the gates just doesn't make sense because of his draft capital, his pedigree. And while sure, yeah, in this offense, it would be great to see him take over the running back one role in this offense, kind of the Elijah Mitchell idea, recapture that. He's inside the top 100 already. And think about the reroll, right? You're able to straight up get a first round pick in 2022. This trade here, now granted, Jamar Chase wasn't quite as ridiculously high valued as he is now. You traded out of the hype of Trey Sermon and the hype of Terrace Marshall, another second round pick, to get into Jamar Chase. Now that one, I don't know how realistic it is, but I'm pulling trades at the peak point here to kind of show you, if you were trying to be diligent about this, maybe you do sell light, so you sell sooner than they actually hit their peak and their dynasty value. Maybe they still kind of gain value for the next couple of weeks, but what's the outcome, a range of outcomes that they're going to be? Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride. I'm not saying some of these players won't be, but overall in process, if you trade a lot of these guys into more safe, secure assets, you're kind of mitigating risk while also getting some of the value out of those picks that is really hard to capture in production. One more here I want to talk about with you, Will Levis. So Will Levis, the interesting part about him, when he took over the quarterback spot for the Titans, Obviously, he ends up having the great week 1, threw 3 touchdowns to DeAndre Hopkins, and then wasn't anywhere near that type of upside for the rest of his season. Still a talented player, starting quarterback in Superflex, so you get the hype around him. But here's the thing. I was looking at some of these trades, and basically with Levis, now I know everyone in their league market is different, and maybe some of these trades weren't available to you, but I think if you get creative, maybe you can do some things that you didn't even think were possible. Some of these trades, I think, are really good ways to get off of Will Levis. I wish I would have had more shares of Will Levis. And Will Levis, Gardner Minshew, who at the time was starting, and a 24 first, get you injured Joe Burrow. Another thing to think about, this is where if you have an excess at quarterback and you can afford to take on an injury like Joe Burrow, that could be available to you. Let's say, though, the Joe Burrow owner's not moving. I think I saw him get traded plenty, but there's probably a lot of managers that are like, I'm not moving Burrow. Will Levis in a 25 first for Dak in a second. I mean, the fact that you got a second back, kind of hilarious. Here's another one. So Will Levis in a 25 first and a 24 second gets you a pivot into Lamar, and somehow you got a pick back. And then if you have excess, I think if you draft a quarterback in the second round there, like one of the dreams is you have him kind of at your disposal to trade without getting a quarterback back. CeeDee Lamb at this point, this is right before they made this big offensive switch and transition to chucking the ball a lot more. They were still trying to run the offense through Tony Pollard. He was a little bit disappointing in production early on in the year. So this trade, again, hindsight's 2020, but Will Levis, a 25 first and a 24 second for CeeDee in another second in 2025. Last thing I want to do here is go over this information with you. So currently inside the top 25, you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, number 9 overall. He's the only player currently inside the top 10 in the second round in this 5-year sample size. Jordan Love, 15th overall in Keep Trade Cut. Sam Laporta, 24th overall. So those 3 players out of 60, that's 5% of the players that were drafted in this pool. So then current top 50, you add 2 more people. Brandon Ayuk, 40th overall, and then Michael Pittman barely slots in, 50th overall, currently inside the top 50. That's 8.33%. So then you have inside the top 75, that's now 6 of them, and that's 10% with T. Higgins, the only person that slots in the top 75. He's number 58. Currently inside the top 100, you got Jaden Reed, number 79. You got Rashad White, number 80. Rashee Rice, 81. And then Will Levis is 83. So this is where I think it's important, at least for me, why I still value second round picks, as long as you have the idea of either trading the pick on the clock, trading the player shortly after you draft them, if there's a massive surge in dynasty value because of hype, whether it's based on something off the field or on the field, even if it's for a small amount of time, 1-2 pop weeks, boom, all of a sudden they're a top 75 option, you might be able to trade them. So players that reached the top 25, that's now 7 out of 60. That's 11.66%. Now, made it to the top 50. So they were valued inside the top 50 on Keep Trade Cut at one point throughout their career. This is now 19 of 60. That's 31.67%. You're getting damn near 1 out of 3 picks in the second round that at one point was being valued inside the top 50. So on those top 75, that's 31 of 60. Over half of the people that you're going to draft in round 2 will get you value inside of the top 75. Inside the top 100, 41 out of 60, that's 68.3% of them got into the top 100 as far as dynasty value goes on Keep Trade Cut. A second round pick, one of the things that's more certain than not is it's going to accrue value. 19 now of the 60 obviously did not reach the top 100. Peaked at draft and never gained value. That's 9 out of 6, 15% of them. Basically, from the moment you drafted, they didn't really have much of a sell window and they started just burning value to you. Well, that's 1 or 2 out of every year on average of the 12 picks that's basically going to burn a hole in your pocket, and you're going to probably go to 0, or you're going to take a huge loss. You'll maybe can sell for a 3rd or a 4th. Point is, more often than not, you're going to get a player that's going to increase in value, 68%. You're going to have a 50% chance to get into a really desirable range of tradability. While second round picks are not necessarily guaranteed to give you production on your team, if you're able to use these picks, buy them at the right time, and either leverage them in trades, whether it's the pick or the player that you draft, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, that can be missed. And it's really easy to draft a player that you're seeing doing well and then eventually just let that player die on your team when you had a chance to trade them. And even though at the time it kind of hurt you, you're hyped about this player, there is so much you could have gained from that trade that you left on the table because you were really into the player hype at that time. That's all I got. Let me know what you think of this one. I'm going to get into round 1 for you next week. A little bit of different conversation, but the same idea. Let me know what you thought of this video down in the comments. I'll see you back here, same time, same place, next week, talking more Dynasty strategy and trades. I'm out of here. Peace.